Hello, my name is Glorious Wizeye. My co-authors, Dr. Julienne Rutherford, Dr. Zaneta Thay, and I would like to thank leadership and organizers of the Joint Mental Health Research and Innovation Day for the opportunity of sharing our work on duration of gestation exposure to genocide against the Tutsi in relation to health outcomes in young adulthood. This study was conducted in Rwanda in East Central Africa. Rwanda lies 75 miles south of the equator and is bordered by Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1994, Rwandans endured one of the most cataclysmic genocides in human history. The genocide against the Tutsi was a result of decades of ethnic tensions and conflict between the Tutsi minority and the Hutu majority, ethnic groups constructed by European colonialists. In a period of 100 days, over 1 million people were killed. Approximately 350,000 women were raped by extremist Hutu, but only 1 in 6 of them survived. It is estimated that between 2,000 and 10,000 children, now young adults, were born of genocidal rape. There is compelling evidence that maternal environmental experience influences offspring health outcomes. Adverse experience, in this case prenatal exposure to genocide, can affect birth outcomes and adult phenotypes through impact on embryonic and fetal development. In our area work among Rwandan adults conceived during the genocide against the Tutsi, we find that Rwandan young adults prenatally exposed to genocide had poorer mental and physical health outcomes compared to age and sex-matched Rwandans who were not prenatally exposed. Those conceived via genocidal rape had poorer health outcomes compared to those exposed to genocide only. And these health outcomes were exacerbated by adverse childhood experience that were higher among those conceived via genocidal rape compared to those born of survivors who were not raped. Prior studies on prenatal adverse experience suggest that exposure in the first trimester of gestation leads to lasting poor health outcomes compared to exposure later in the pregnancy. However, it is unclear how variation in duration of exposure during the first trimester relates to health outcomes, specifically whether the length of gestation exposure to maternal stress related to genocide or genocidal rape is associated with variation in adult health outcomes. Though tragic, the genocide against the Tutsis provides a unique possibility to explore this relation in humans. We conducted a cross-sectional study to test our hypothesis. A total of 91 24-year-old Rwandans were enrolled. All participants were estimated to have been conceived during the genocide by backdating from their birth date to the period of genocide, April 7th to July 4th, 1994. Participants were categorized to 3 groups: 31 adult children of women who survived the genocide and were not raped or single exposed, and 2 control groups of age and sex matched Rwandans, 30 conceived via genocidal rape or double exposed to genocide and the genocidal rape, and the 30 Rwandans who were conceived during the genocide, but while their mothers were living outside the country, or an exposed group. Using this sample, we evaluated whether the duration of prenatal exposure to genocide is associated with variation in adult health outcomes. Specifically, we expect that shorter duration of exposure will be associated with better health in those exposed in utero to genocide only. We expect to see weaker or no association between duration of prenatal exposure to genocide and health outcomes in those conceived via genocidal rape, which is a traumatic event that we anticipate continued to contribute to stress beyond acute period of genocide due to continued stigma and shame associated with conception from rape. We do not expect to see any association between the duration of gestation that corresponds to the period of genocide and any measured health outcomes in those exposed to neither genocide or genocidal rape. Our independent variable was the duration of exposure to genocide. The genocide against the Tutsi happened during a period of 12 weeks and 5 days. Those conceived earlier in the genocide experienced longer duration of prenatal exposure to genocide. For participants conceived at the beginning of the genocide, the maximum exposure was 12 weeks and 5 days in duration. We conducted surveys to collect participant demographic characteristics, including adverse childhood experience as measured by Adverse Childhood Experience International Questionnaire, and mental health outcomes, vitality as measured by SF36, and anxiety and depression as measured by PROMIS 29 version 2.2. Version 2.0. Physical health outcomes included subscapular and triceps skin fold thicknesses, as well as BMI. Consistent with prediction among the single exposed group or exposed to genocide only, shorter duration of prenatal exposure was associated with higher scores of fatality and low scores of depression and anxiety. The association between exposure duration and vitality and anxiety remains significant even after controlling for participant sex and adverse childhood experience. The duration of exposure was not associated with variation in anthropometric measures for the single exposed group or any measured outcomes among individuals conceived via genocidal rape or the non-exposed group. We hypothesized that shorter duration of prenatal exposure to genocidal stress will be associated with better health outcomes in those individuals exposed to genocide alone in the first trimester. Conversely, we hypothesized a response to duration of prenatal exposure in those conceived by genocidal rape due to expectation that the shame and stigma of genocidal rape would persist for the woman throughout the pregnancy, even when the genocide ended. Our findings were consistent with both hypotheses. First, we find that single exposed individuals conceived later in the genocide, thus exposed to shorter durations, had significantly better mental health outcomes, specifically vitality and anxiety, than those who were conceived earlier and exposed for long time. It is possible that the maternal buffering systems could be sufficient to address shorter periods of adversity, hence explaining the reduced effect among those conceived later in the genocide period. Second, double exposed individuals showed no significant association between adult health and duration of the first trimester exposure. This could be explained by the fact that the fetus was exposed to stress beyond the genocide duration, and thus gestational stress remain high across pregnancy, even for those conceived later in the genocide. In fact, survivors of genocidal rape consider this experience as worse as the genocide itself. Notably, in our previous analysis, we show that those individuals conceived via genocidal rape reported more adverse childhood experience compared to age and sex matched young adults born of survivors were not raped. There was no association between the duration of prenatal exposure and anthropometric measures in any group. In our previous work, we did not find that the groups differed significantly from each other in any of anthropometric measures, except for height. Double exposed individuals were significantly shorter than unexposed. This could be due to the fact that our sample overall was young and lean. As expected, there was no association between any measured outcome and the duration of exposure among an exposed group, given that this was a control group and that was not actually exposed to neither genocide or genocidal rape. Overall, this finding points to the importance of protections and care for pregnant people in the midst of genocide or other extreme social political events as early as possible to mitigate adverse outcomes in a prenatal exposure to extreme stress. Our findings suggest that any reduction in the length of exposure has potential to mitigate the effect of prenatal exposure to genocide and similar adversities on health. Thus, our work is yet more evidence for the need for regional, national, and international policies that identify the risk of impending genocide and other kinds of mass political violence and enact practices to prevent it from starting or mitigate its scope. Sensitive trauma-informed screening for psychological distress, including rape experience, should be part of prenatal care to provide tailored intervention and establish postnatal care and support for families to ensure positive childhood experiences. Despite the strength of this analysis, including a collection of data among a unique cohort of individuals conceived during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, our study has several limitations. Our sample size is relatively small and not representative. Specifically, we were only able to recruit individuals who survived to adulthood. Hence, this study is not free of survivor bias. Another important limitation is that we calculated conception by backdating from birth date using a duration of a term pregnancy. Some differences in health outcomes could be related to preterm birth. Finally, where the duration of the genocide is measured in dates on the calendar, the lingering impact of experience is impossible to measure fully using quantitative measures. Transdisciplinary methodologies are necessary to fully grapple with effects of genocide within and across generations. Our next step is to conduct the DNA methylation analysis from the dry blood spots collected during this study in order to examine the epigenetic pathways potentially linking prenatal genocide exposure to health outcomes measured in adulthood. Finally, we plan to initiate prospective study to better grasp health change as this population ages and study the pregnancies of this population as and their offspring to determine whether and how genocidal trauma passes to the next generation. In conclusion, our studies show that duration of exposure in the first trimester is associated with variation in adult health outcomes. Prenatal care that promote conducive family and community environments that allows the fetus's natural protection system to develop and operate effectively are ideal. Mitigative interventions should be provided as early as possible targeting pregnant people and all individual prenatally exposed to genocide or genocidal rape. Biological and social pathways linking genocide exposure and health outcomes should continue to be explored. Prospective studies among this population could help identify patterns of health changes as this population ages and it begins a family of their own. Would like to acknowledge the University of Illinois at Chicago, the Graduate College, University of Illinois at Chicago College of Nursing, Margaret McMullen Education Grants, Dartmouth College Societal Fellows that support me during the study duration. Special thanks to the study participants, Sevota and Avega Gahozo, for that facilitated access to our participants. We thank you for listening.
Before introducing my research, I want to talk about reflexivity. To ensure scientific rigor as a qualitative researcher, I'm continuously reflecting about how my attitudes and beliefs influence this research. I recognize that I and the other stakeholders involved inevitably shape the data I'm finding with our lenses, which is why I'd like to first present who I am. My name is Jasmine Wu, and I'm a non-Indigenous second-generation Chinese-Canadian student. Through weaving in and out of two different cultures in my personal life, I desire to foster connection between different worldviews, which is the basis of this project. Despite being trained in the biomedical sciences, my reflexivity has allowed me to engage ethically in this cross-cultural research so as to not perpetuate neocolonial harms against Indigenous peoples. And with that preamble, I present my study. I first map out the evolution of mental health and addiction services for Indigenous peoples in Canada, leading me to introduce the integrated care approach, which I'll explore in depth. So throughout history and into the current day, Indigenous peoples have faced systemic threats to their cultures through colonialism and neocolonialism. As Indigenous cultures are deeply connected with their traditional lands, processes of cultural assimilation and forced relocation to the reserves have resulted in intergenerational trauma and cultural discontinuity. Paired with the poor social determinants of health, many Indigenous communities face higher rates of mental health and substance use disorders, with suicide rates tripling the non-Indigenous average. But it does not end there. Even if mental health services are available, they may not actually meet the needs of Indigenous peoples in terms of their mental health due to conflicting worldviews. In particular, the Indigenous understanding of health as being holistic is devalued in mainstream mental health services, which instead emphasize biomedicine, individualistic treatments, and ultimately Western superiority. These biases contribute to the disproportionate mental ill health disparity faced by Indigenous peoples. So from realizing this inadequacy, the concept of integrated care was created, and studies have shown that this approach benefits Indigenous peoples. This model uses two-eyed seeing, using the one eye to see the strengths of Indigenous knowledge, and with the other eye, the strengths of Western knowledge for the benefit of all. But why does this work? One explanation is the application of cultural safety. Integrated care mandates genuine power sharing in the care delivery, that patients and community determine the type of care they receive, and that practitioners reflect on their biases and privilege, thus overcoming the limitations of mainstream mental health services. From this literature review, we have uncovered the nature of disconnection between Indigenous perspectives and mainstream mental health services. However, we have yet to explore how we bring the two together in integrated care. More specifically, what are common lessons, disjunctures, and potential solutions that arise in such integration? By studying this research question, we hope to provide insight into the process of integration, ultimately facilitating the use of integrated care in future programs. On a broader scale, this work may contribute to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Canada's calls to actions by addressing the distinct health needs of Indigenous peoples and recognizing the value of Indigenous healing practices within treatment. Now let's move on to the study methods, which was co-designed by an Indigenous knowledge keeper and practitioner. 35 programs providing mental health and/or addictions care to Indigenous adults aged 18 plus were recruited from various online databases. Inclusion criteria consisted of the program incorporating Indigenous practices such as cultural ceremony and Western practices such as counseling and their care delivery. And we verified this on each of the program's website. We emailed our Qualtrics surveys to each of the programs, and participants could also recommend 1 to 3 key informants in the demographics form to be interviewed. In terms of the measurement tools, we used various modalities to ensure scientific rigor through triangulation. Our surveys collect factual information through close-ended and short-answer questions, and our interviews explore the relational processes of the program with open-ended questions. After transcribing our interviews to date, we have analyzed the data using an inductive approach, meaning we allowed the interviewee's voice instead of our own lens to guide us to a theme, thus reducing bias. This is an iterative process, meaning that interviews were mutually informing. And we have also worked with Indigenous collaborators to ensure knowledge co-creation, which falls into our methodology. Another part of our methodology we'd like to highlight is our use of Kaupapa Maori, an Indigenous framework that has informed us on how to uncover the hidden power relations within society, for example, what's perpetuated by language. We avoided assuming that medicalized language, such as the word treatment, was appropriate for all programs, as some programs do not relate to that terminology. Thus, we have created different versions of our measurement tools with the terms that programs use themselves based off of their website. Now here is our data, starting with the survey results. Common points in Table 1 include providing culturally specific training to new staff and having partnerships with non-Indigenous stakeholders for funding, supplementary care, and training. After transcribing our interviews and analyzing them, we have found 5 themes and 7 sub-themes. So the first theme are lessons that we have learned from the programs. Specifically, programs demonstrated real commitment to the communities and community involvement. This is shown by the sub-themes of self-determination. So first, community members met to discuss the causes of mental health and substance use disorders, resulting in programs that originated from their community's needs and goals. And we also have to note the lack of accessible mental health services in these communities as a factor to these programs being created. Moving on to the continuity of care, programs strive to support their clients from beginning to end and especially emphasize aftercare. They have a common goal of preventing clients from falling through the cracks upon leaving, and so thus programs are attuned to the range of home environments that clients may have. With meaningful engagement in programming, programs often cycled former clients and gave community members with lived experience leadership positions within the program. And so these leaders often shared their own stories to build a relationship with the newer clients. This showed an intersection between personal and professional identity. And finally, with the importance of evaluation, programs were always growing and evolving to allow for always up-to-date service delivery and meaningful partnerships. There was also a need for safe and non-judgmental environments to collect feedback from everybody who's involved, and this was manifested in our interviews as quote-unquote open door policies. So moving on to the tensions and disjunctures, programs, to begin, often viewed culture as healing. So for example, programs were grounded in respect and honor for all living things, Inuit knowledge principles, and etc. Programs also had a strong understanding of what happened to their communities and thus used a trauma-informed care. And finally, elders were a cornerstone to many programs, and they have lots of authority and respect, but also have a grounding presence about them that helps the client in treatment. Yet there's a layer of complexity here when we consider the variation in responses towards the notion of culture as healing. So although many clients ascribe to culture as healing, other clients have been taught to feel shame about their cultures. So for example, when colonization had caused some communities to ban their cultural practices and some people to have a mental block when trying to speak their language, as shown by our interviews, these clients often become hesitant to engage with the cultural programming. Finally, another layer of complexity relates to the range of cultural programming. So for example, our interviews revealed that programs often adapted from Western frameworks and models to fit their community's needs. So such as creating a circle of security parenting program, but adapted it to the community's values. Other programs directly used their community's methods, such as sharing circles, healing circles, sweats, cleansing rituals in cold water, and etc. And even other programs had to innovate according to their particular environment. So some programs provided on the land learning, but in an urban context. Another recurring theme in the programs was to provide a personalized, strengths-based approach. As such, clients were able to determine their own goals and heal from within rather than follow the practitioner's agenda. This aligned with the harm reduction approach many programs incorporated. So instead of defining the standard of success, programs often allowed their clients to determine their measures of success, such as drinking and using substances in a healthier way rather than becoming completely sober. Moreover, programs often chose to focus on collectivism and community healing rather than the Western notion of individualism. Furthermore, this approach of helping those beyond the person seeking treatment aligned with the Indigenous epistemology of relationality, the interconnectedness of all people, the natural environment, and the spiritual world. Finally, we arrive at our final theme, the colonial power dynamics. In exploring our subthemes, we learned that programs often face the challenge of inaccessible medicalized language and concepts in the care delivery. This occurs when practitioners communicate with clients, but also when clients communicate with their elders, and is due to the language and cultural barriers and different levels of Western education. Culturally unsafe practitioners was another subtheme related to the ignorance and unawareness that may lead to Western knowledge being imposed in the care delivery. This prompts the need for continuous education from programs about the validity of Indigenous practices. And finally, a prominent subtheme was funding as an influencer, which affects programs' availability and quality. The colonial government continues to control funding, which creates power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system, even if efforts are being made to ensure genuine power sharing within integrated care through cultural safety. And this obviously perpetuates Indigenous health inequities. So placing our study findings in theory and history, we ask, why do these tensions and disjunctures exist? Starting with the complexity of clients' trust, we related this tension disjuncture to internalized oppression. This internalized oppression is also often passed down intergenerationally, contributing to the loss of culture and language community space. Explicit oppression is highlighted by these subthemes of medicalized language and concepts and culturally unsafe practitioners. The former creates exclusivity that privileges those with formal Western education and also limits the cohesion in the care delivery due to communication barriers. The latter perpetuates Western superiority and prevents the cultural safety mandate from being met, thus creating a power imbalance of Indigenous and Western values within the care delivery. Fortunately, our interviews show us that many programs are striving to leverage Indigenous knowledge and values in the program development and content. However, human resources is another limiting factor. So for example, Indigenous practitioners are underrepresented in healthcare because to become one requires lifelong learning from ancestors and immersive personal experiences. Learning to share land-based teachings and hold ceremonies takes more time, space, and spiritual involvement than obtaining an academic degree to become a Western practitioner. The different ways of obtaining Indigenous versus Western knowledge and different values placed on credentials may explain the tensions of why Western knowledge is currently perceived as more official or superior in healthcare. Finally, funding was a prominent challenge to navigate and can be explained by the government's use of classical contracting, where funding is given in short-term blocks with limited flexibility. This creates a disconnection within the services, and contracts are short-term, but the need for distribution is ongoing, resulting in uncertainty about whether programs are able to continue into upcoming cycles and how to allocate funding. This is very disruptive to both staff and clients. Drawing on integrated care's lessons, we show the need to move towards ind equity, a concept proposed by Downey in 2020. Currently, our lesson of real commitment to communities and community involvement reveal that programs are striving towards self-determination, meaning they start from within, and programs also value Indigenous knowledge systems, as shown by the continuity of care that is holistic and the importance of evaluation, emphasizing collaboration and consensus, which also fall into Indigenous knowledge. Finally, programs are working towards a rights-based approach by including those seeking treatment into decision-making positions and processes, as shown by the meaningful engagement subtheme. While programs work towards ind equity, Downey suggests that more can be done regarding Indigenous allyship. So for example, our survey results show that many programs offer culturally specific training to new staff, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. However, some programs go beyond by offering direct experiences, such as inviting them to participate in ceremony. Downey also encourages that allies fiscally support programs to help with real change. Our survey results show that programs often have partnerships with non-Indigenous organizations for funding and extra care and training, but our recommendation is to expand on this and look at what type of funding it is, moving from classical to relational contracting. Relational contracting holds mutual trust between both parties at its core, thus allowing for more self-enforcing mechanisms of fulfilling accountability and stronger relationships. Therefore, relational contracting helps reduce the traumatizing service provision problems that programs are currently facing and helps them move towards community ownership. As integrating Indigenous and Western knowledge into mental health and addictions care for Indigenous peoples become more common, it is important to acknowledge the lessons, tensions, and disjunctures experienced by existing integrated care programs. And to conclude, we revisit the two-eyed seeing approach. Integrated care works because there is value in both Indigenous and Western knowledge. However, there is a strong need for Indigenous self-determination, meaning integration must start from Indigenous knowledge. The goal is also not to remove resources from other health and social services, but rather to distribute them more equitably to achieve inequity. So in the end, integrated care should create something new and appealing that uses the strengths of both knowledge systems together and truly for the benefit of all. Thank you, and I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Spy and Dr. McDougall, and Standing Strong Spirit and Joanne Town, who have guided me and supported me in this research.
Hi, my name is Ramesa Pervez, and today I will be presenting the findings from the study titled Evaluating the Impact of a Community-Developed Recovery-Oriented Psychosocial Rehabilitation Toolkit in Kenya, a mixed method study. More than 85% of the world's population live in low to middle income countries. More than 80% of people who have mental disorders are residing in these countries. Mental health and substance use disorders are the leading cause of life years lost due to disability worldwide. And despite the high prevalence and significant disease burden, many people with mental and substance use disorders in low to middle income countries, such as Kenya, do not receive any form of treatment, even though effective interventions exist. And for the purposes of this research, we'll be specifically sharing the mental health challenges individuals face in Kenya. In Kenya specifically, the psychiatrist to population ratio is low. It is 1 to 600,000 people. There are a total of 100 psychiatrists, and around 70% of the people living in rural areas, and most psychiatrists are living in Nairobi, which is the capital city. There's an apparent shortage of training expertise and uptake in psychosocial rehabilitation for people with serious mental illnesses in Kenya. Further driving the burden of mental illnesses and poor mental health in Kenya and other low to middle income countries are the high levels of stigma and discrimination associated with these disorders and the social determinants of poor health, such as poverty. So this is where our project comes in. What is Create Kenya? Create stands for Community Recovery Achieved Through Entrepreneurism. This strategy was developed to address the need for cost-effective, innovative interventions for persons with serious mental illnesses in low to middle income countries. This community-based rehabilitation approach couples the work integration social enterprise model with low-cost PSR supports in the form of a toolkit. And that toolkit is the Psr Toolkit. And this toolkit consists of best practices in psychoeducation and recovery-oriented PSR, illness management, and empowering peer support and interventions. The toolkit is divided up into 1-hour sessions and can be facilitated over 14 weeks. It can be facilitated by peers or healthcare professionals. The PSR toolkit is comprised of 2 main sections, one of them being psychoeducation, which is geared to help participants learn about serious mental illnesses and its impacts on the individual's daily lives. The second component is recovery-oriented PSR practice tools, and this consists of skills training modules to support self-management of these mental illnesses. So the initial pilot for the PSR toolkit was situated in Machakos, Kenya, and it engaged employees with serious mental illnesses as part of an innovative social business model. And we saw promising results from this first pilot. Now, this current study expanded the PSR toolkit into 2 different psychiatry services. One, Machakos Level 5 Hospital, and 2 was Mtweni Level 3 Outreach Clinic. While the country currently does not have a specific budget for mental health services, there's a growing interest in improving the mental health of its citizens. There's a need to implement rehabilitation services in hospitals and healthcare settings to combat mental illnesses and effectively care for individuals and family members who are affected. PSR can be impactful across the world, and this study aims to demonstrate its effectiveness in Kenya. The purpose of this pilot study was to evaluate the impact of implementing the PSR toolkit within the mental health clinic in a tertiary hospital in Kenya, with regards to the impact on recovery and associated attitudes for people with serious mental illnesses and their family members. Second, the design, delivery, and contextual factors that influence participant experience. This pilot study employed a mixed methods sequential design using focus groups and individual interviews. A total of 24 pairs of primary participants were included with their family members, which gave a total sample size of 48. Patients that were eligible had a diagnosis of a serious mental illness, were registered patients of one of the two medical sites, and were between the ages of 18 to 16. The intervention consisted of weekly hour sessions over 14 weeks. Data gathered through the study entailed patient and family participants completing questionnaires on attitudes towards recovery, illness management, mental health, and quality of life. The questionnaires were conducted pre and post intervention. Focus groups were conducted post-interventions, and the overarching intent of the inquiry was to consider the potential impact of the PSR toolkit on the lives of participants. So in regards to the quantitative data that was collected through the questionnaires, the results are presented in this table here. And I'll talk more about the results that were statistically significant. So for primary participants, we see that they experience moderate, statistically significant improvements on their illness management and recovery scale. So that's the IMRS here. And for family members, we saw that they experienced a moderate, statistically significant increase on the recovery attitudes questionnaire, which is right here. And although there's an increase, this means that there is an actual worsening of the recovery attitudes through the questionnaire. And we'll discuss the results later on in the presentation. In regards to the qualitative findings, overall, we saw positive outcomes for both the primary participant and their family members. So for the question, how does participation in the toolkit impact people's lives? A participant shared with us, I'm no longer scared about life because the toolkit gave me hope. In this question, we saw that the toolkit helped individuals create a sense of possibility for the future, allowed them to advocate against stigmatization of mental health. For the second question, which asks, what design and delivery factors influence participants' experience of the toolkit? We saw three sub-themes, including the need for committed and involved stakeholders, including peer involvement, helpful and accessible learning materials, and flexible local solutions to promote continued involvement in the toolkit for participants and their loved ones. For the question, what broader contextual factors influence participants' experience of the toolkit? The themes that were seen for this specific question was that there needs to be more support at the macro community level from mental health service development more broadly, and specifically for the toolkit implementation through community involvement. Also, individuals talked about the income generation that came from the mental health program and how it was beneficial for them. In regards to our next steps, and our overall findings, we saw that the overall findings were positive. The results indicated that primary participants had a strong connection to recovery. They held a new and powerful sense of their potential recovery and a sense that life was improving. We saw contradictory findings for family participants. And although we saw a worsening in recovery attitudes, which was mentioned in the methods section, focus groups and interviews showed us an improvement in overall well-being. And these contradictory findings between the data may have been due to cultural language barriers associated with the written questionnaire. In regards to our next steps, we're currently in the process of analyzing the data collected through a recent implementation study, which assessed the feasibility, scalability, and sustainability of the PSR toolkit. And the findings will help us inform our next steps. So I'll actually talk a little bit about the PSR toolkit implementation study. The overarching aim of this implementation research project is to build a robust implementation and evaluation strategy to improve the outcomes of people living with serious mental illnesses and their families in Kenya. The purpose of this study is to engage with local stakeholders to understand the issues that impede effective implementation of the PSR toolkit and to develop approaches to identifying, understanding, and overcoming barriers to the sustainability, feasibility, and scalability of this evidence-based intervention across the country. And in the focus groups and interviews that I've conducted, I ask questions specifically around the delivery, evaluation, and training model. So the qualitative study is guided by current literature and implementation science. And I used focus groups and interviews with different stakeholders to understand the needs, their readiness, their interest to engage with the toolkit delivery and how it may be further adapted to the local setting. Stakeholder groups will also be involved in developing an implementation strategy that identifies their needs and ability to contribute to this step. So I've made 2 visits to Kenya so far, and the first visit consisted of recruiting participants, engaging with them, and developing trusting relationships, which is essential when building partnerships with community-based organizations. So I was able to recruit up to 63 participants, and these participants varied. Some were primary participants, their family members and loved ones. I recruited some hospital clinic providers, community stakeholders, so some of the community mental health-based organizations such as USP Kenya, Basic Needs, and also Kenyan government officials. And it's essential to get buy-in from the Kenyan government officials so they can eventually fund these projects and heavily promote them within the community. And then in regards to the preliminary findings from the qualitative data through the focus groups and interviews, we saw that a setting outside from the hospital and business settings is important, especially for those living in rural areas. And when we interviewed a local social enterprise representative, they mentioned how engaging with gatekeepers that are leaders in the community to promote the program is essential. A lot of people that need the support living in rural areas do not know where to access these resources or how to access these services such as the Psr Toolkit, and which is very instrumental. And that's a direct quote, which I've included in the slide. We learned from hospital clinicians from Machakos Level 5 that there is an importance of involving family members and loved ones in the local Kenyan context. And Kenyan local and national policymakers demonstrated an interest in getting trained on the Psr toolkit to help grow their understanding on mental illnesses. So using these findings, we will collaborate with the key local stakeholders to do 2 of the following things. 1, refine how the Psr toolkit is implemented to better fit with the local context, needs, and resources. 2, develop a sustainable plan to evaluate the PSR toolkit's ongoing use, adaptation, and the ways in which it impacts the lives of persons with serious mental illnesses in Kenya. And eventually, through these findings, we hope to after we've created a more refined and sustainable model, we hope to scale the program to other settings in Kenya and other low to middle income countries. That concludes my presentation for today. Thank you for listening.